We're selling the house, Elle. It's for the best. The words hung in the air between us, shimmering in the candlelight like heat haze. Richard sliced into his steak, the knife scraping against the porcelain with a sound that grated on my teeth. He hadn't looked at me when he said it. His focus was entirely on the perfect cross-section of pink meat. A task he approached with the same surgical precision he applied to every aspect of our lives. My life. For 30 years, the words we and I had been interchangeable in his vocabulary, but only when spoken by him. When I used I, it sounded selfish, a discordant note in the symphony he had so carefully composed. I placed my fork down, the tines clicking softly against the rim of my plate. My own dinner was barely touched. The knot in my stomach, a familiar companion, had tightened into a solid stone. Selling? I managed, my voice a thin, reedy thing I barely recognized. Richard, this is our home. He finally looked up, a patient, almost weary smile gracing his lips. It was the smile he used when I was being particularly slow, when the simple, elegant logic of his decisions failed to penetrate my supposedly cluttered, emotional mind. It's too much for us now, darling. The upkeep, the empty rooms. Think of the freedom. We can downsize, get a lovely apartment downtown. Travel more. I've already spoken to Henderson Realty. They are coming Monday to do an initial appraisal. Monday. It was Saturday. My world was being dismantled in a weekend, and I was the last to know. I could feel the blood drain from my face, a cold tide receding, leaving me numb and pale. The dining room, with its heavy mahogany furniture, and the portraits of his ancestors staring down from the walls, suddenly felt like a mausoleum. For 30 years, I had polished this wood, arranged flowers in the crystal vase on the sideboard, and chosen the damask curtains that now felt like suffocating drapes. I had poured my life into the cracks of this house, filling the spaces he didn't occupy with my silent, invisible labor. And he was selling it. You didn't think we should talk about it first. The question was a whisper, a ghost of defiance. He reached across the table and patted my hand, his touch light and dismissive. Now, Elle, don't get worked up. There's nothing to talk about. The numbers make sense. It's the logical next step. I've run all the projections. He leaned back, satisfied, taking a sip of his wine. You don't have to worry your pretty little head about a thing. I've taken care of everything. Worry your pretty little head. The phrase landed like a slap. He'd been saying it for as long as I could remember. It was his anesthetic, the sweet poison he used to paralyze my thoughts, to shrink my world down to the manageable domains of garden parties and dinner menus. And for so long, I had let him. I had allowed myself to become small, to believe that my head was indeed just a pretty, empty vessel, incapable of grasping the complexities of finance, or the gravity of life-altering decisions. But tonight, something was different. The poison wasn't working. The stone in my stomach began to burn. I looked past him, my gaze settling on a small, dark object on the mantelpiece across the room. It was my mother's jewelry box. A simple, rosewood chest, its varnish worn thin at the corners, the mother-of-pearl inlay chipped in one spot. Richard hated it. He called it clutter, a repository of worthless baubles and sentimental junk. He had often suggested we throw it out, or at least store it in the attic with the other relics of my pre-Richard life. But I had always resisted, quietly, stubbornly. It was the one piece of me that had never been absorbed into his world. He followed my gaze and his lip curled slightly. Don't worry, you can take that old thing with you. I know how much you love your trinkets. His condescension was a physical force, pressing me down into my chair. He believed he was being generous. He believed he was giving me everything by taking everything away. In his mind, the house, the money, the decisions, they were his. The life we lived was his creation, and I was merely its most favored resident. My contribution, my 30 years of partnership, had been reduced to a collection of trinkets in a worthless box. The burning in my stomach spread, a slow, determined fire. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt the flicker of a different kind of thought. Not a worry. An idea. That night, sleep was a distant country I could not reach. I lay beside Richard's peacefully breathing form, the chasm between us wider than the few inches of mattress. The house sighed and settled around me, its familiar groans sounding like farewells. Each creak of the floorboards was a memory, each whisper of wind against the window pane a story. I thought of our daughter, Lily, away at university, the one person who saw the cracks in the perfect facade. "Mom, why do you let him talk to you like that?" she'd asked during her last visit, her young face furrowed with a concern that was achingly familiar. It was the same look my own mother used to give me. I had always brushed it off, defending him, defending the life I had chosen. "That's just your father's way," I'd say, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. But Lily was right. My mother was right. The silence I had cultivated for decades was not peace, it was surrender. My accommodation was not love, it was erasure. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet silent on the cold wood floor. In the living room, moonlight streamed through the large bay window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the still air. It cast a silver glow on the mantelpiece. I walked towards it, drawn by an invisible thread. My fingers, trembling slightly, traced the worn edges of the rosewood box. It was cool to the touch, solid and real in a world that had just been rendered illusory. This box was mine. It had been my mother's, and her mother's before that. It contained the narrative of the women I came from, a lineage of quiet strength he had never bothered to understand. He called its contents trinkets. And they were. A string of faux pearls my father gave my mother on their first anniversary. A silver locket with a faded picture of me as a gap-toothed child. A collection of mismatched earrings, brooches shaped like butterflies and autumn leaves, all costume jewelry with no monetary value. But they were not worthless. Each piece was a chapter. Each piece was a testament to a life lived, a love felt, a moment cherished. He saw junk, I saw history. My history. With a resolve that felt foreign and exhilarating, I lifted the heavy lid. The scent of old wood and faint, lingering perfume rose to meet me. Tucked beneath a velvet tray of rings was a thick bundle of letters tied with a faded silk ribbon. And beneath those, something else. A manila envelope, stiff with age, its edges softened and frayed. My name was written on the front in my grandmother's elegant, looping script, "For Eleanor. When she needs it." I had never opened it. I had forgotten it was even there, a secret kept from myself. My heart began to beat a frantic, hopeful rhythm against my ribs. The house was his. The money was his. But this box, this envelope, this was mine. And I was beginning to understand that when she needs it was now. The fire inside me was no longer just a flicker. It was a flame, and in its light, I was finally starting to see a way out. The following days were a study in quiet subversion. On the surface, I was the same Eleanor. I made Richard his morning coffee, discussed the weather, and nodded placidly as he detailed the real estate agent's enthusiastic assessment of the property. I moved through the house like a ghost of my former self, my smile a carefully constructed mask, my words few and far between. He mistook my silence for acquiescence, for the gentle melancholy he expected from me. "You'll see, Elle," he'd say, patting my shoulder. "It'll be a grand new adventure for us." He was blind to the tectonic shift occurring beneath his feet, the slow, grinding separation of my world from his. Inside, I was a whirlwind of activity. My first secret act of rebellion was a phone call. I took the cordless phone out into the garden, my sanctuary, and sat on the cold stone bench surrounded by my sleeping roses. My fingers shook as I dialed the number Lily had given me months ago, a number I had written on a slip of paper and tucked into the very manila envelope I had just rediscovered. For when you're ready to talk to someone, Mom. Just in case, the voice that answered was calm and professional. Law Offices of Albright and Associates, how may I help you? My name is Eleanor Vance, I said, my own voice surprisingly steady. I need to make an appointment with Ms. Albright. It's a personal matter. The appointment was set for Wednesday. 2 days. It felt like a lifetime and no time at all. My second act was to truly examine the contents of the envelope. I waited until Richard was at his golf club, a predictable Tuesday morning ritual. I took the jewelry box into the sunroom, the one room in the house that felt more mine than his, and sat in my favorite wicker chair. The sun warmed my face as I carefully slid my finger under the brittle flap of the envelope. Inside were not just letters, but documents. Old, crackling papers filled with dense, legal language. There was a deed, registered in the state of Maine, for a small parcel of land with a 2-bedroom cottage. It had been left to me in a trust by my grandmother, a trust that had matured on my 18th birthday, a detail lost in the whirlwind of my courtship with Richard. I remembered visiting the cottage once, as a small girl. It was nestled in a cove by the sea, smelling of salt and pine. And there was more. Tucked within the folds of the deed were a series of bearer bonds, purchased by my father in the 70s. They were made out to me, a gift for a future he would not live to see. I stared at the numbers, the crisp engraving. To me, they were just paper. But my conversation with Lily, her insistence that I needed to understand my own financial standing, had planted a seed. I knew, with an instinct that was both terrifying and thrilling, that these papers were more than just sentimental artifacts. They were potential. They were leverage. They were a key. When Richard came home, flushed with victory from his golf game, he found me in the kitchen, humming as I prepared a salad for lunch. He beamed, interpreting my mood as acceptance of his grand plan. "That's my girl," he said, kissing the top of my head. "See? A little change is good for us," I simply smiled, the expression feeling less like a mask and more like a shield. He saw a placid surface, but beneath it, I was charting a new course on a map he didn't even know existed. He was navigating by the stars he had named himself, while I was finally learning to read the true constellations, the ones my grandmother and father had left for me in the sky. The afternoon before my appointment with Ms. Albright, I undertook my third act of quiet rebellion. I began to pack. Not the whole house, not the grand, sweeping purge that Richard was planning, but a small, personal culling. I went into the attic, a space I hadn't entered in years. It was a graveyard of forgotten things, shrouded in white sheets like so many ghosts. There were boxes labeled Richard's college textbooks, and Richard's ski gear. And in a far corner, covered in a thick layer of dust, were 3 boxes simply labeled Eleanor. My life before him, condensed and archived. I opened one. The scent of old paper and dried flowers wafted out. Inside were my journals from my teenage years, filled with terrible poetry and fierce, passionate dreams of being a painter. There were sketchbooks filled with charcoal drawings of hands, faces, landscapes. I ran my fingers over a drawing of a windswept cypress tree, the lines still bold and full of life. I had been good. I had forgotten that. I had packed away my talent along with my canvases and paints when Richard had declared my hobby a messy distraction. I carried the boxes downstairs, one by one, and placed them in the spare bedroom. Richard was out at a board meeting. The house was mine. For hours, I sat on the floor, surrounded by the debris of my former self. I wasn't just sorting objects, I was reassembling a person. I found my university diploma, a degree in art history he had always referred to as that little certificate you got. I found photographs of my friends, women I had lost touch with because Richard found them too loud or a bad influence. In one of the photos, I was laughing, my head thrown back, my hair a wild mane around my face. I was 22, standing on a beach, holding a paintbrush like a scepter. I didn't recognize the joyful, unbridled woman in the picture. When had she disappeared? It hadn't happened all at once. It had been a slow erosion, a death by 1,000 tiny concessions. The hobby given up. The friend not called back. The opinion not voiced. The decision not questioned. Each one a grain of sand slipping through my fingers until the beach was gone, and I was left standing on his solid, unyielding stone. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, I carefully placed the journals, the sketchbooks, and the photograph into a new, sturdy box. I then went to the jewelry box and retrieved the manila envelope. I placed it on top of the other items. This box was not a collection of forgotten things. It was an arsenal. Tomorrow, I was going to war. Not with shouting and anger, but with quiet facts and papers he had never known existed. He thought he was dismantling my life. He had no idea I was in the process of building a new one, from the foundations of the woman he had tried so hard to bury. The law office of Ms. Albright was located in a restored brownstone, its interior a surprising blend of modern minimalism and antique warmth. It did not feel like a place of conflict, but of clarity. A young paralegal led me to a corner office with a large window overlooking a quiet, tree-lined street. Ms. Albright rose from behind a sleek glass desk to greet me. She was younger than I expected, perhaps in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a handshake that was firm and reassuring. "Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice even and kind. "Thank you for coming in. Please have a seat. Can I get you some tea?" I sat in a leather chair that felt both soft and supportive. "Yes, please. That would be lovely." My hands were clasped tightly in my lap, the straps of my handbag digging into my fingers. Inside it was the manila envelope, feeling as heavy as a stone. As she prepared the tea at a small side counter, she spoke without turning around. "Lily has told me a little about your situation. She's very concerned about you." The mention of my daughter's name was both a comfort and a pang of guilt. "She's a good daughter," I said softly. "She is," Ms. Albright agreed, placing a steaming cup and saucer on the small table beside me. "She also said you were one of the strongest women she knows, even if you don't always see it yourself." She sat down opposite me, her expression open and patient. "So, Eleanor, may I call you Eleanor, tell me what's happening." And so I did. For the first time, I gave voice to the slow, suffocating reality of my marriage. I spoke of the financial control, the casual dismissals of my thoughts and feelings, the way my world had been systematically shrunk until it fit neatly into the palm of Richard's hand. I told her about the house, the sudden decision to sell it, the phrase "don't worry your pretty little head," that had finally broken something inside me. I spoke calmly, without tears, my voice gaining strength as the words, so long suppressed, finally found their way into the air. She listened without interruption, her gaze never leaving my face. She didn't nod sympathetically or offer placating murmurs. She simply listened, affording my story the weight and gravity I had never allowed it myself. When I finished, a profound silence filled the room. It wasn't an awkward silence, but a contemplative one. Ms. Albright leaned forward slightly. "And your husband controls all the finances?" "Everything," I confirmed. "The accounts are in his name. The house is in his name. Our investments, well, his investments. He gives me an allowance for groceries and household expenses. It's generous, but it's an allowance." "I see," she said, her pen tapping softly on a legal pad. "And you believe you have no assets of your own?" This was the moment. My heart hammered against my ribs. I reached into my handbag and pulled out the old manila envelope. My hand trembled as I passed it across the desk to her. I have this, I said. My grandmother left it for me. I don't know if it's anything. Ms. Albright handled the envelope with a careful reverence. She slid the contents out and spread them on her desk, the deed, and the sheaf of bearer bonds. She picked up the deed first, her eyes scanning the legal description, the signatures, the notarized stamps. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. She then turned her attention to the bonds, examining them one by one. She looked at the issue dates, the face values, the coupon rates. She made a few notes on her pad, her brow furrowed in concentration. After several long minutes, she looked up at me, and her eyes were shining. Eleanor, she said, her voice imbued with a new energy. This is most certainly something. She picked up the deed. This cottage in Maine. The trust it was in protected it from becoming marital property. It is yours, and yours alone. According to the county records I can pull up right now, property values in that specific coastal area have, well, they have skyrocketed. My breath caught in my throat. And these, she continued, gesturing to the bonds. Bearer bonds are rare now, but these are perfectly valid. They've been maturing for over 40 years. With the accrued, compounded interest, she paused, tapping a few calculations into her computer. She turned the monitor towards me. A number was displayed on the screen. It was a substantial number, a number with many zeros. It was a number that represented not a fortune, but freedom. I stared at the screen, the digits blurring through a sudden film of tears. It wasn't the money itself that moved me. It was the validation. It was the sudden, earth-shattering realization that I was not empty-handed. I was not a dependent. I had my own history, my own legacy, and it had been waiting patiently for me in a dusty rosewood box. He thinks it's all sentimental junk, I whispered, a tear finally escaping and tracing a hot path down my cheek. Ms. Albright leaned forward, her expression a mixture of professional satisfaction and genuine human warmth. Well, Eleanor, she said, a true, brilliant smile breaking across her face. We are about to teach your husband the true value of sentiment. The war had begun, and for the first time, I knew I was armed. The strategy Ms. Albright laid out was one of quiet precision, a reflection of the person I was becoming. There would be no dramatic confrontations, no screaming matches. The goal was not revenge, but release. The goal was a clean, orderly extraction from the life that was suffocating me. For the next 2 weeks, I became a covert operative in my own home. I moved with a newfound purpose, my actions imbued with a secret knowledge that made every mundane task feel significant. While Richard was at his office or the golf course, I worked with a quiet intensity. Ms. Albright had connected me with a financial advisor, who helped me understand the full implications of my inheritance. The bearer bonds were carefully deposited into a new bank account in my name only. An appraiser was discreetly sent to the cottage in Maine, confirming its considerable value. Each phone call made from the sanctuary of my garden, each document signed and couriered back to Ms. Albright's office, was a brick being laid in the foundation of my new life. Richard remained blissfully unaware. He saw my quiet industry and mistook it for nesting, for preparing for our new adventure in the downtown apartment he had already picked out. He saw me sorting through closets and drawers and assumed I was following his directive to get rid of all this clutter. He had no idea that I was performing a delicate triage, separating the essential parts of my own story from the props of his. I packed my books, my old sketch pads, the few photographs of my parents that hadn't been relegated to the attic. I packed the clothes I truly loved, not the ones he preferred me to wear. Each item placed in a box was a reclamation. One afternoon, he found me in the spare room, surrounded by boxes neatly labeled E. Vance. He leaned against the doorframe, smiling his benevolent, patronizing smile. Getting a head start, are we? That's my efficient girl. Just make sure you don't throw out anything important by mistake. I won't, I said, looking up at him from the floor. My gaze was level, my voice calm. For a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of confusion in his eyes, a momentary disruption in his placid certainty. My lack of fluster, my directness, was outside the parameters of the character he had written for me. But he dismissed it as quickly as it appeared, chucking it up to my newfound efficiency. He couldn't conceive of a reality where my actions were not in service of his plans. His blindness was my greatest asset. The most difficult conversations were with Lily. I called her every evening. At first, I was vague, telling her only that I was taking some steps. I was afraid to give her false hope, afraid that this surge of courage would falter. But Lily, with her fierce, unwavering belief in me, pushed for more. "What kind of steps, Mom?" she asked one night, her voice sharp with a mixture of hope and anxiety. "Are you really going to do it?" I took a deep breath, the scent of night-blooming jasmine from the garden filling my lungs. "I met with a lawyer, honey." I heard her sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Oh, Mom. Oh, thank God. Is she good? Do you trust her?" "Yes," I said, and the word was solid, absolute. "She's very good. And it turns out I have some resources of my own. From Grandma." The dam of my reserve broke, and I told her everything. About the cottage by the sea, the bearer bonds, the number on the computer screen. I told her about Ms. Albright's strategy. Lily was silent for a long moment, and I could hear her quiet, ragged breathing. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears. "Grandma knew," she whispered. "She always knew he was a bully. She left you an escape hatch." Her words hit me with the force of a revelation. An escape hatch. That's exactly what it was. A way out, built by the love of a woman who had seen the future more clearly than I had. The strength of my grandmother, my father, and now my daughter, flowed into me, a powerful current washing away the last vestiges of doubt. I was not alone in this. I was the culmination of their hopes, the executor of their quiet faith in me. The day of the final meeting was deceptively bright and sunny. Richard had called it a mere formality, a meeting with our lawyers to sign the separation agreement he had drafted. He was in a magnanimous mood, humming as he put on his most expensive suit. He believed he was orchestrating a civilized, amicable end, one where he would emerge looking generous and fair. "You'll be perfectly comfortable, Elle," he said, adjusting his tie in the hall mirror. "I've made sure of it. A nice little nest egg for you. No one can say I haven't done right by you." I said nothing. I simply picked up my handbag, which contained a single file folder prepared by Ms. Albright, and my mother's jewelry box, which I carried cradled in my arms. He noticed the box and chuckled. "Bringing the family jewels, are we? Don't worry, I'm not after your costume diamonds." The meeting took place in a sterile conference room at his lawyer's firm. It was all glass and chrome, a space designed for transactions, not emotions. Richard sat at the head of the table, flanked by his attorney, a stern-looking man named Mr. Davies. I sat opposite them, with Ms. Albright by my side. Her presence was a bastion of calm in the tense, sterile air. I placed the jewelry box on the table in front of me, my hand resting on its worn rosewood lid. Mr. Davies began, his voice a dry monotone, as he walked us through the separation agreement Richard had proposed. It was exactly as Richard had described it, generous, on his terms. He was keeping the house, the art collection, the investment portfolio. I was to receive a lump sum payment, enough to live on, but not enough to truly be independent. It was a golden cage, a continuation of his control in a different form. When he finished, Richard leaned back in his chair, a benevolent smile on his face. "So, there you have it. Clean and simple. I believe you'll find the terms more than fair, Eleanor." Ms. Albright did not look at the papers in front of her. She looked directly at Richard. "The terms are unacceptable," she said, her voice clear and cutting through the smug atmosphere. Richard's smile faltered. Mr. Davies stiffened. "Unacceptable. Mrs. Vance has no assets of her own. My client is being extremely generous." "That is where you are mistaken," Ms. Albright said. She slid my file folder across the table. "My client has her own assets. Significant ones." Mr. Davies opened the folder. His eyes widened as he saw the official appraisal for the main cottage. His face paled as he read the statement for my new bank account. He looked up, first at Richard, then at me, his professional composure completely shattered. Richard snatched the papers from him. He stared at them, his face a mask of disbelief. "What is this? This is impossible. Where did this come from?" His voice was rising, a note of panic creeping in. I finally spoke. My voice was quiet, but it filled the room. "It came from my family, Richard." I rested my hand on the jewelry box. "From the sentimental junk you were so happy for me to keep." His eyes darted to the box, then back to my face. The disbelief was curdling into fury. The benevolent patriarch was gone, replaced by a cornered, bewildered man losing control. You hid this from me." "I didn't hide it," I replied, my voice still even. "You just never saw it. You never saw me." The truth of the statement hung in the air, undeniable and devastating. Ms. Albright took control again, her tone crisp and businesslike. "As Mrs. Vance's assets are her own separate, premarital and inherited property, they are not subject to division. Therefore, the proposed settlement is wholly inadequate. We have a counter-proposal." She laid out our terms. I was not asking for half of his wealth. I was not asking for anything that was his. I was simply walking away with what was mine. The house would be sold, as he wished, but the proceeds would be split according to state law regarding marital assets accumulated during the marriage, a far more significant sum than his nest egg. His investment portfolio, his art, he could keep them. All I wanted was a fair division of the life we had built together, and the full, uncontested ownership of the life I had built apart. Richard was sputtering, his face flushed a dangerous shade of red. This is an ambush. After everything I've done for you. I gave you everything." "No, Richard," I said, and I stood up, my chair scraping back softly. I looked at him, truly looked at him, perhaps for the first time without the filter of fear or duty. I saw not a titan, but a small man, terrified of a world he could not completely control. "You gave me what you thought I was worth. My grandmother gave me what I was." I picked up my jewelry box. It felt light in my arms. Ms. Albright gathered her papers and stood beside me. We turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving Richard and his lawyer sitting in stunned, furious silence. The sound of the heavy glass door clicking shut behind me was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of my own freedom. The drive away from the city was a quiet, surreal journey. Ms. Albright had arranged for a car, and as we moved from the dense urban landscape of chrome and glass to the green, open highways, I felt a physical unburdening with every mile that passed. The tension that had lived in my shoulders for decades began to dissolve. I watched the city skyline shrink in the rearview mirror, until it was just a jagged line on the horizon, and then nothing at all. I did not look back. I had expected to feel a tumultuous storm of emotions, anger, grief, perhaps even a lingering sadness for the 30 years I had invested in a hollow partnership. But instead, what washed over me was a profound and gentle calm. It was the quiet that comes after a fever breaks, the stillness of a lake after a violent storm. The battle I had dreaded for so long was over, and it had been won not with shouting, but with the quiet, unassailable power of truth. We drove for hours, heading north. Ms. Albright, sensing my need for silence, worked on her laptop, leaving me to my thoughts. I held the rosewood box in my lap, my fingers tracing the familiar, worn patterns. It was no longer just a box, it was an anchor, a compass, a declaration of self. It was the physical manifestation of a value that could not be appraised by a real estate agent or calculated by a financial advisor. It was the repository of my soul. When we finally turned off the main highway and onto a winding coastal road, the air changed. It grew heavy with the scent of salt and pine, a smell that was deeply, primordially familiar. It was the scent of my childhood, a memory I hadn't realized I had kept so perfectly preserved. We passed through a small, sleepy town with a single general store and a lobster shack, and then the road narrowed further, hugging the rocky coastline. And then, I saw it. Tucked into a small cove, surrounded by towering pines and hardy, wind-scoured birch trees, was the cottage. It was smaller than I remembered, a simple, cedar-shingled structure, with white trim, and a small porch facing the sea. Its windows looked out over a small, private beach of smooth, grey stones. It wasn't grand or imposing. It was perfect. The driver parked the car, and I stepped out. The sound of the waves crashing on the shore filled my ears, a rhythmic, eternal sigh. It was a sound of immense peace. Ms. Albright came to stand beside me, a small, satisfied smile on her face. "Welcome home, Eleanor," she said softly. The key, which had been inside the manila envelope all along, slid into the lock with a satisfying click. The door swung open onto a single, large room, filled with the dusty, golden light of late afternoon. There was simple, sturdy furniture covered in white dust cloths, a large stone fireplace, and at the far end, a wall of windows that framed the endless, blue-gray expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. It was empty, but it felt more full than the house I had just left. It was filled with possibility. After Ms. Albright left, promising to handle the remaining legalities from a distance, I was truly alone for the first time. The silence was immense, broken only by the cry of a distant gull and the murmur of the sea. I walked through the small house, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. I ran my hand along the cool, smooth surface of the stone fireplace. I opened a window and let the salt air flood the room, chasing away the scent of disuse and time. I didn't unpack. I didn't clean. I simply sat on the covered sofa, placed the jewelry box on the coffee table in front of me, and watched the light change over the water. The sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and pink and deep, bruised purple. It was a spectacle of raw, untamed beauty, and it belonged to no one. It simply was. And for the first time in my adult life, I felt that I simply was, too. Not Richard's wife, not Lily's mother, not the lady of the grand house on the manicured street. Just Eleanor. A woman sitting in her own house, watching her own sunset. As darkness fell, I didn't turn on a light. I stayed there, in the deepening twilight, listening to the ocean. I thought of my grandmother, a woman I remembered as having hands that were always busy, knitting, gardening, baking, but whose eyes held a deep, knowing stillness. She had seen the steel in Richard's spine and the fragility in mine. She hadn't warned me away from him, she knew I wouldn't have listened. Instead, she had left me a map and a key, trusting that one day I would be ready to read it. I finally lifted the lid of the jewelry box. I didn't reach for the papers, the deed, the proof of my worth to the outside world. I reached for the things Richard had called worthless. I picked up the string of faux pearls and clasped them around my neck. They were cool against my skin. I found the silver locket and opened it, looking at the gap-toothed, smiling girl inside. I saw the spark in her eyes, the untamed joy. She hadn't disappeared. She had just been waiting. She had been here, in this box, all along. A profound, quiet joy bloomed in my chest, a feeling so pure and radiant it felt like swallowing sunlight. I was not starting over. I was picking up where I had left off. The first few months in Maine were a quiet revelation. The rhythms of my life began to follow the tides rather than a social calendar. My days were measured in sunrises over the water and the slow, deliberate work of making the cottage my own. I stripped the dust clods from the furniture, polished the old wood until it gleamed, and filled the rooms with wildflowers I gathered from the meadows behind the house. I found a local contractor, a woman with kind eyes and sawdust in her hair, who helped me repair the porch and repaint the trim. Every decision was mine. The color of the paint, the placement of a chair, the type of herbs to plant in the window box, small acts of sovereignty that felt monumental. Lily came to visit for a week in early autumn. When she stepped out of her car and saw the cottage, its windows bright and a curl of smoke rising from the chimney, she burst into tears. They were tears of relief, of joy. "Oh, Mom," she said, hugging me tightly. "It's real." We spent the week walking on the beach, collecting sea glass and driftwood. We cooked together in the small, functional kitchen, our laughter echoing in the cozy space. I showed her my old sketchbooks, and for the first time, I told her about my dream of being a painter. She listened with an attentiveness Richard had never afforded me. "You should start again," she said, her voice full of earnest conviction. "You have a studio now," she gestured to the small, sun-drenched spare room I had set up with an easel and a table, its windows looking out over the churning sea. I had bought canvases and paints and charcoal, but I hadn't yet touched them. I was afraid. Afraid that the girl in the photograph was gone for good, that the talent had atrophied from disuse. "I don't know if I remember how," I confessed, the fear a small, cold knot in my stomach. Lily picked up a piece of charcoal and a blank sheet of paper and placed them in my hands. "You don't have to remember," she said gently. "You just have to begin." After she left, I stood in front of the blank canvas for a long time. The fear was still there, a whispering voice telling me it was too late, that I was too old, that the dream was foolish. It was Richard's voice, an echo I still carried inside me. But then I looked out the window at the ocean, at the relentless, powerful waves that had been crashing against these rocks for millennia. The ocean did not ask for permission. It did not worry about being good enough. It simply was. I picked up the charcoal. And I began. The first lines were hesitant, shaky. But then, something shifted. My hand remembered the old, familiar movements. The line grew stronger, more confident. I wasn't drawing the ocean. I was drawing the feeling of it, its power, its wildness, its deep and enduring peace. I drew for hours, losing all track of time, the charcoal dust blackening my hands and clothes. When I finally stepped back, the canvas was no longer blank. It was filled with a fierce, chaotic, beautiful energy. It was a self-portrait. The legal proceedings with Richard concluded with a series of sterile emails between our lawyers. He fought, of course. His pride was wounded more than his finances. He sent one final, personal letter to the cottage. It was filled with accusations, with wounded indignation, with a complete and utter lack of understanding. He wrote about his betrayal, his disappointment. He never once mentioned love or loss, only the disruption of his well-ordered world. I read it, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness. Only a distant, clinical pity for a man so trapped in the prison of his own ego. I burned the letter in the stone fireplace and watched the ashes float up the chimney and disappear into the vast, open sky. My new life took shape, not through grand gestures, but through small, accumulated moments of grace. The satisfaction of a perfectly baked loaf of bread. The joy of seeing the first crocuses push through the thawing soil in spring. The quiet companionship of a stray cat that adopted my porch. The day I sold my first painting at a small gallery in town. It was a small, abstract seascape, the one I had drawn that first day. The gallery owner told me the buyer had been moved by its emotional honesty. Emotional honesty. The phrase stayed with me. For 30 years, I had lived a life of emotional dishonesty, pretending to be content, pretending to be small. The art, like the cottage, like my entire new life, was an act of finally telling the truth. One evening, I sat on my porch, wrapped in a thick quilt, the old jewelry box on the table beside me. The sky was clear and littered with a million brilliant stars. I looked at the box, its purpose now fulfilled. It was no longer an escape hatch. It was a foundation stone. It held not just the legal documents that had secured my freedom, but the narrative that had made it possible. It held the love of my grandmother, the foresight of my father, the misplaced dreams of a young woman, and the fierce hope of a daughter. It held the truth that Richard could never see, that a person's worth is not in what they can be given, but in what they already hold inside. They will try to tell you that you are nothing without them. They will try to define your value, to appraise your soul, and to put a price tag on your history. They will look at the things you cherish, the memories, the quiet dreams, the sentimental junk in your own jewelry box, and they will call them worthless. They will build a world around you and tell you it is the only one that exists. Do not believe them. The quietest corners of your heart, the forgotten parts of your own story, the things you have packed away in the attic of your soul, that is not clutter. That is your inheritance. It is your arsenal. The strength you need is not something you have to find, it is something you have to remember. It has been there all along, waiting patiently in the dark for you to reclaim it. Your history is your kingdom. Your heart is your throne. And you alone, are its rightful and sovereign ruler. You just have to be brave enough to pick up the crown and place it on your own head.